Picture a vast plantation in Maryland, early 19th century. The golden sun rises slowly over endless fields of tobacco and corn. At first glance, it seems almost beautiful, an image of abundance. But then the air is torn apart by the crack of a whip, followed by a cry of pain. That is the true sound of this land, a kingdom built not on freedom, but on chains. It was into this world, in 1822, that a baby girl was born. Her name at birth was Araminta Ross, later known to history as Harriet Tubman. From the very moment she opened her eyes, society had already placed shackles around her. She was not a citizen, not even considered a child with a future. By law, she was property, something to be used, sold, punished, or discarded. Harriet grew up in a rough wooden cabin, cramped and cold, shared with family members who lived with the constant fear of being torn apart. At night, she would hear the cries of mothers and fathers whose children had been sold to distant plantations, never to return. For Harriet, love always carried a shadow, the terror that any day someone she cherished could vanish forever. By the age of 6, she was hired out to another household, forced to watch over a baby. If the infant cried, Harriet was whipped until her back bled. She was still a child herself, unable to understand why she was punished so cruelly. But even then, the scars began shaping her spirit. Yet within this frail girl, there was something unbreakable. Harriet was known for her stubbornness. When ordered around, she often met commands with a steady, piercing gaze, an unspoken defiance that seemed to declare, "I am more than this." At night, when the stars appeared overhead, she would look toward the north, imagining a world she had never seen, whispering silent prayers for freedom. Her parents planted in her a seed of faith. Her mother whispered prayers over her children. Her father reminded her that freedom was not just a dream, it was a God-given right. They taught Harriet that while chains could bind the body, no chain could ever capture the soul. But the cruelty of slavery did not forgive even the smallest act of resistance. When Harriet was a teenager, she witnessed a fellow enslaved man trying to escape. She stepped forward, desperate to shield him from the overseer's rage. The man in charge hurled a heavy iron weight. It struck Harriet's head with brutal force, knocking her unconscious. Blood ran down her face. She nearly died that day. The injury left her with a permanent scar, one that never healed. For the rest of her life, she suffered sudden spells where she collapsed into deep, dreamlike trances. To many, it was a disability, but to Harriet, it became something else. In these visions, she felt God speaking to her, showing her signs, filling her with strength. From that moment on, Harriet believed her life had a purpose far greater than survival. Slowly, the fear inside her hardened into resolve. She had seen too much. Families destroyed, lives stolen, humanity denied. If she remained, she would share the same fate. She would be broken, bought, and buried by the system that fed on her suffering. So beneath the quiet light of the moon, Harriet made a decision that would shape history. She would run, not just for herself, but for everyone she loved, for every soul whose heart still beat with longing for freedom. This was the beginning of a journey that would one day earn her the name Moses of her people. A woman who stood barely 5 feet tall, who could not read or write, who lived with constant pain, yet who carried within her the courage of an entire nation. But in that moment, she was not yet a hero. She was only a young woman with a scar on her head, a prayer on her lips, and her eyes fixed on the stars of the north. From the fields of Maryland, she would rise. From the heart of bondage, she would carve a path to freedom, and history would never forget her name. The night was still when Harriet Tubman finally took her first step toward freedom. The moon cast a pale glow over the Maryland fields, and the woods seemed alive with whispers. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves made her heart thunder. She was not just running away, she was declaring war on a system that had ruled her life since birth. She knew the risks. The Fugitive Slave Act meant anyone, anywhere could capture her and drag her back in chains. Posters with rewards for runaways littered taverns and courthouses, each word a reminder that her very existence was worth more as a prize than as a human being. If she was caught, the punishment would be brutal: whippings, shackles, perhaps even death. Yet, Harriet pressed forward. Guided by the North Star, she crept through swamps and forests, her feet sinking into mud, her breath shallow with fear. Sometimes she hid in hollow logs. Other times, she crouched silently as hunting dogs barked in the distance. Every sound could mean discovery. Every shadow could hide a pursuer. But Harriet was not entirely alone. She had heard whispers about a secret network, the Underground Railroad. It was not a real railroad, but a path of hidden safe houses, barns, and secret allies who despised slavery. Brave men and women risked everything to guide runaways northward. To Harriet, it felt like the hand of Providence itself reaching down to lead her forward. When she finally crossed the line into Pennsylvania, her lungs filled with air that felt different. Freedom had a taste, and for the first time in her life, she was not someone's property. She was her own. Standing on free soil, Harriet lifted her face to the sky and whispered, "I had crossed that line. I was free. But there was one of two things I had a right to, liberty or death. If I could not have one, I would have the other." But the story of Harriet Tubman could never end with her own escape. Freedom, once tasted, burned too fiercely inside her to be kept to herself. In Philadelphia, she worked, saved, and listened. Each day, she thought of her family still in bondage, of friends still bent beneath the overseer's lash. Her heart ached. How could she live free when so many remained in chains? That was the moment conflict took root in her soul. She could stay in the North, safe but alone, or she could risk everything by returning to the land of her suffering. Most would have chosen safety. Harriet chose otherwise. She turned back toward Maryland, not once but again and again. In the years that followed, she became a conductor on the Underground Railroad, guiding groups of enslaved men, women, and children to freedom. Armed with courage and a pistol at her side, she led them through forests and rivers, whispering commands in the dark, pointing always toward the North Star. The dangers were constant. Slave catchers patrolled the roads. Rewards for her capture rose higher and higher until she was one of the most wanted women in the South. To her enemies, she was a fugitive. To those she rescued, she was a savior. She never lost a single passenger. With sharp instincts and unshakable faith, Harriet kept her groups moving, often traveling by night and resting by day. If someone grew weak or panicked, she pressed the pistol into their hands and whispered fiercely, "You'll be free or you'll die. There's no turning back." The conflict was not only external, it raged inside her too. Harriet carried the weight of responsibility for every life she guided. Each journey haunted her with fear. What if she was discovered? What if she failed? And yet, each successful rescue made her resolve stronger. She believed she was chosen by God to be an instrument of deliverance. But with each journey, the price on her head grew higher. Betrayal was always a possibility. Even among allies, she had to measure trust carefully. At any moment, a kind smile could mask a traitor's heart. Still, Harriet pressed on. She risked capture, she risked torture, she risked death. Conflict defined her life. Freedom against slavery, hope against despair, love against fear. And in every battle, Harriet Tubman chose to fight. By the time her legend spread across the South, she was known as Moses, the woman who led her people out of bondage. Her enemies cursed her name, but to those who followed her, stumbling barefoot under the cover of night, she was proof that courage could defy an empire. And yet, the deeper Harriet journeyed into this path, the more dangerous the road became. The Civil War was on the horizon. The nation itself was tearing in two. Harriet's mission was no longer only about saving individuals, it was about something far greater. Her fight had become part of America's fight, and soon she would step into a conflict larger than she had ever imagined, one that would shape not just her destiny, but the destiny of an entire nation. The whispers of Harriet Tubman's name spread across the plantations like fire carried by the wind. To enslaved men and women, she was more than a rumor. She was hope itself. Some called her Moses, the deliverer of her people. To slave owners, however, she was a phantom, a menace who struck fear into their hearts. They raised the bounty on her head to staggering amounts. Yet still she moved unseen, untouchable, a shadow in the night, guiding souls toward freedom. Her missions became daring acts of defiance against one of the most powerful systems in the world. She traveled in disguises, sometimes as an old woman with a bonnet pulled low, sometimes as a free black man with a worn hat and pipe. Her courage was matched by her cunning. Slave catchers scoured the roads, searching for her face, but Harriet always slipped past them. It was as though Providence itself shielded her. Each journey carried new dangers. Families whispered prayers as they followed her through swamps and forests, sometimes carrying infants whose cries could betray them. Harriet devised clever ways to keep the children quiet, rocking them in her arms and even dosing them with soothing herbs to keep them asleep while danger lurked nearby. She was unyielding in her resolve. No one would be left behind. Her legend grew, not because of luck, but because of her unbreakable will. Harriet often carried a pistol, not just for protection against slave catchers, but as a stern warning to those she guided. Fear could cause hesitation, hesitation could cause discovery, and discovery meant death for all. If anyone threatened to turn back, Harriet's voice cut like steel. "You'll be free, or you'll die here. There's no going back." Those words, fierce and uncompromising, kept the group moving forward. But Harriet was not simply a rescuer. She became a strategist. She learned the landscape like the back of her hand. Rivers, hidden paths, safe houses marked with secret signs. She collaborated with the Quakers and other abolitionists who ran the Underground Railroad, weaving herself into a network that stretched from the South to the Free States in the North and even into Canada. Each journey added to her knowledge, and each success deepened her reputation as the fearless conductor who never lost a passenger. The tension of each mission built Harriet's spirit into something larger than life. She was no longer simply Harriet, the runaway slave. She was Harriet Tubman, Moses of her people, defying the chains of slavery with nothing but faith, courage, and relentless determination. Yet, the rising storm of conflict in America loomed in the background. The North and South drew closer to war with each passing year. The question of slavery divided the nation like a wound refusing to heal. Harriet's personal war was soon to become a national one. By the late 1850s, her missions multiplied. She guided her own brothers to freedom, reuniting with family in moments filled with tears and trembling joy. She brought elderly men and fragile children across hundreds of miles, carrying the burden of responsibility on her small but unyielding frame. Each successful rescue fanned the flames of rebellion in her heart. But Harriet's rising action was not just about freeing individuals. She began speaking publicly in abolitionist circles, her voice carrying the weight of lived truth. Though she was uneducated and could not read or write, Her words had a power that pierced hearts. Audiences leaned forward as she recounted stories of the whips, the chains, the escapes, and the miraculous deliverance of her people. She was no longer moving only in shadows. She was becoming a voice of conscience in the open. In 1859, Harriet's rising arc collided with one of the most explosive figures of the abolitionist movement, John Brown. The fiery white abolitionist was planning an armed insurrection at Harper's Ferry, a raid meant to ignite a slave uprising that would shake the South to its core. Brown saw in Harriet not just an ally but a general. He called her General Tubman, recognizing her tactical mind and unmatched courage. Though Harriet did not take part in the raid itself, her connection to Brown tied her even more deeply to the revolutionary pulse of the era. The Civil War was fast approaching, and Harriet's life was poised to expand far beyond clandestine midnight journeys. Soon, her fight would not only be in the forests and rivers of the South, but on the battlefields of a divided nation. Yet, even in this rising tide of conflict, Harriet's personal struggles deepened. She carried scars on her body and mind from years of slavery. She suffered frequent headaches and narcoleptic spells, the lingering result of a brutal blow to the head she had endured as a teenager. But rather than see this as weakness, Harriet believed her visions and fainting spells were divine messages. She trusted them as guidance from God Himself, and they gave her the strength to press forward when others would have faltered. The climax of Harriet's rising action was not just her increasing fame, but the transformation of her identity. She was no longer a runaway, no longer a fugitive. She was a leader, a liberator, a soldier in the war against slavery. Every life she freed was another crack in the walls of oppression, another light piercing the darkness. And yet, danger stalked her every step. Slave owners raged, increasing their vigilance. Posters offered astronomical sums for her capture, dead or alive. Betrayal was always one whisper away. But Harriet Tubman had chosen her path long ago. She would not turn back. As the storm clouds of war gathered above America, Harriet prepared for her next chapter. Her struggle had begun in silence, in shadows, in swamps and forests. Now it was about to break open into the thunder of cannon fire and the clash of armies. Harriet Tubman's rising action was not just the rise of one woman, it was the rise of a revolution. The air in America crackled with tension, torn by gunfire and smoke. The Civil War had erupted, dividing brother against brother, North against South, and freedom against bondage. For Harriet Tubman, it was the war she had been fighting her entire life. But now, the battlefield stretched beyond forests and rivers. The war for the soul of a nation had begun. When the Union Army learned of her reputation, Harriet was not invited to watch from the sidelines. She entered the war as she had lived, unflinching, determined, unstoppable. At first, she served as a nurse, tending to wounded soldiers with her rough but tender hands. She brewed herbal remedies, poultices and teas from her deep knowledge of roots and plants, passed down from generations of enslaved healers. White doctors looked at her with suspicion, but the soldiers trusted her. When fevers broke and wounds closed under her care, her quiet authority spread through the camps. But Harriet Tubman was no ordinary nurse. She knew the land. She knew the rivers, the swamps, the secret paths of the South, and she knew the enemy. Union officers soon realized that Harriet was far more valuable than they had imagined. They entrusted her with tasks that demanded cunning, stealth, and courage, reconnaissance, scouting, and espionage. By night, she slipped behind Confederate lines, blending into the world she once escaped. Disguised as a washerwoman, a field hand, or an old, hunched servant, Harriet gathered whispers of Confederate movements, troop numbers, supply lines. No one suspected the frail-looking woman scrubbing clothes or humming hymns was delivering intelligence that could sway battles. She memorized every detail with razor precision, then carried the knowledge back to Union commanders. Her work saved lives, her reports changed strategies, and slowly her name began to echo through the halls of military command. But Harriet was not content to merely inform the war. She wanted to act. She wanted to strike. The opportunity came in the summer of 1863. Along the coast of South Carolina, hundreds of enslaved men, women, and children still toiled in bondage. Confederate strongholds lined the rivers, guarded by soldiers who believed themselves secure. But Harriet had a plan, bold, dangerous, almost unthinkable. She would lead a raid, guiding Union gunboats up the treacherous Combahee River through waters laced with mines and traps into the very heart of enemy territory. The goal? To destroy Confederate supplies and liberate as many enslaved people as possible. On the night of June 1, 1863, the moon cast a silver glow over the water as 3 Union gunboats prepared to move upriver. On board one of them stood Harriet Tubman, not as a nurse or spy this time, but as a leader, the first woman in American history to command an armed military operation. Her voice carried above the sound of the river. Calm, firm, assured, she directed the pilots through the hidden channels she knew so well. Confederate lookouts, fooled by the darkness and the precision of her navigation, failed to stop them. The Union boats slipped past the danger and pressed deeper into enemy territory. At dawn, the gunboats unleashed fire upon Confederate outposts, their cannons thundering across the low country. Plantations burned. Bridges collapsed. Confederate soldiers scattered in chaos. And then the true miracle began. From the fields and cabins along the riverbanks, enslaved people heard the roar of Union guns and saw the approach of freedom. They dropped hoes and baskets, fled into the marshes, ran with children on their backs and hope in their hearts. They surged toward the river, toward the boats, toward Harriet Tubman. "Come on," she shouted, her arms outstretched as the first wave of escapees reached the banks. "Come with us! Freedom is here!" They poured onto the gunboats. Men, women, infants, the elderly. Fear flashed in their eyes, but Harriet's presence steadied them. She guided them aboard, comforting the weak, urging the hesitant, holding the hands of those who trembled at the unknown. By the time the raid ended, more than 700 enslaved people had been liberated in a single night. It was a victory unlike any other in the war. Newspapers reported the astonishing feat, praising Harriet Tubman as both hero and commander. For the Confederacy, it was a devastating humiliation. Not only had their defenses been broken, but a woman, an escaped slave, had orchestrated their defeat. The Combahee River Raid was the climax of Harriet's wartime service, the living embodiment of her lifelong mission. She had not only freed individuals in secret journeys, she had now delivered hundreds in the blaze of war. But her triumphs came at great cost. Harriet continued to serve, risking her life again and again, yet she was never paid the salary promised to her. She lived on meager rations, often without proper shelter, even as Union officers relied on her guidance. Still, she did not waver. The work was not for recognition or reward. It was for freedom. As the war raged on, Harriet remained a steady presence, tending the sick, gathering intelligence, and inspiring soldiers with her unyielding faith. In her prayers, she still spoke to God as she had in the swamps of Maryland, asking for strength, asking for protection, asking for the chains of her people to be broken forever. By 1865, the war neared its bloody conclusion. The Union Army advanced, the Confederacy crumbled, and President Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation into law, declaring the freedom Harriet had risked her life to bring. When the cannons finally fell silent, Harriet Tubman stood not as a fugitive, not even just as Moses, but as a warrior who had changed the course of history. Her climax was not a single moment, but a crescendo of defiance, faith, and victory. The girl who once fled through the woods alone was now a woman who led hundreds to freedom and struck a blow against an empire of chains. The war was over. The guns had fallen silent, and America stood at the threshold of a new era. Slavery, the monstrous system that had chained millions, was abolished by law. But for Harriet Tubman, freedom was never just a word written on parchment. It was lived reality. And reality, she knew, was far more complicated than a signature. When she returned home to Auburn, New York, she was not greeted with parades or riches. Despite her legendary service, the Union Army never paid her the full wages she was owed. She had risked her life as a spy, a nurse, and a commander, yet the government treated her with indifference. Often she lived in poverty, struggling to make ends meet. She opened her door to the poor, the sick, and the elderly, sharing what little she had, even if it meant going hungry herself. But Harriet Tubman had never sought glory. What mattered was the mission. She turned her energy toward healing, building, and lifting others. She cared for orphans, fed the hungry, and housed the homeless. With the help of friends and abolitionists, she established the Harriet Tubman Home for the Aged, a refuge where former slaves and the elderly could live with dignity in their final days. For Harriet, freedom was incomplete unless it meant care for the weakest among us. In her later years, her body bore the weight of decades of sacrifice. She had endured seizures and headaches since childhood after the brutal blow from an overseer's iron. But her spirit never dimmed. Even as an old woman, she spoke at gatherings, her voice still ringing with conviction. She supported women's suffrage, standing shoulder to shoulder with leaders like Susan B. Anthony, declaring that liberty meant nothing if women remained voiceless. Yet for all her heroism, Harriet lived humbly. She could have demanded recognition, but instead she chose humility and service. When admirers called her Moses, she often smiled shyly and said she had only followed God's orders. To her, she was simply a servant of freedom. When Harriet Tubman passed away in 1913, she was laid to rest with military honors. The same woman once denied payment for her service was finally recognized as a soldier of freedom. At her funeral, voices rose in the spirituals she had sung along the Underground Railroad. Songs of pain and deliverance, of bondage and hope. Songs that had carried her through the swamps and rivers now carried her into eternity. Her legacy did not end in the grave. Harriet Tubman became more than a historical figure. She became a moral compass. Her life teaches us that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to move forward despite it. That freedom is not given but fought for, preserved and shared. That the measure of greatness lies not in wealth or power, but in how one uplifts the lives of others. She had been a runaway slave, a conductor of the Underground Railroad, a nurse, a spy, a military leader, and a champion of justice. But at her core, Harriet Tubman was something greater still. Proof that a single life, fueled by faith and determination, can alter the destiny of a nation. Even today, her dream remains alive. In classrooms, her story is told to children who learn that no chain is unbreakable. In movements for justice, her name is invoked as a reminder that freedom is always worth the fight. And in the quiet moments of doubt, when despair whispers that the struggle is too great, her voice still echoes, "You'll be free or die." Harriet Tubman's story is not just America's story, it is humanity's story. a story of endurance, of hope, of the unyielding belief that tomorrow can be brighter than today. She was born in chains. She died a free woman, and she left behind a legacy that will never be forgotten.